Hi, folks. A Doctor of Economics here in Japan. Thanks for coming. 皆さん、こんにちは。経済学博士です。In this YouTube channel, I'd like to hold casual study sessions to talk about economics with you. I'm happy if we share our knowledge and skills and think together about what we are currently studying. このチャンネルでは、経済学に関するいろいろなことを共有する勉強会を開催しています。よろしくお願いします。Alright, now let's get down to business. In this series, Overview of Japanese Finance 2022, we'll look at the characteristics of Japanese finance over lots of issues. Today is the third installment. Today's topic is deficit and debt. Let's think together about the national deficit and the debt in Japan from an international comparative perspective. Okay, now let's get down to business. First, let's take a look at Japan's budget deficit. The following chart shows trends in general account expenditure and tax revenue. This chart is taken from the Japanese Public Finance Fact Sheet 2022, published by the Japanese Ministry of Finance. We'll look at many other figures today, all of which are taken from this website. Okay? And the general account is the main account in the government's finances. There are several types of national accounts. For example, pension finances are accounted for separately from regular finances, with revenues and expenditures handled in a special pension account. Public budget should be organized according to a number of principles, which are called budget principles. One of them is the principle of unity, which states that there should be only one budget and not multiple budgets. Okay? Thus, in principle, it's desirable to consolidate the government's finances into a single account, which is the general account. Okay? However, in reality, due to various circumstances, the government finances are not fully consolidated into a single account and are divided into several accounts in the form of special accounts and so on. Okay? In summary, the general account is the main account of the country and we talk about the country's finances or budget. We usually refer to the general account. Okay, let's look at the chart. The horizontal axis is the calendar year, and the vertical axis is the monetary value. The unit is trillion yen. Okay. The red line represents the country's general account expenditure in Japan. Okay. The blue line shows tax revenue of the national general account. For example, The latest data for 2022 shows general account expenditure of 107.6 trillion yen and tax revenue of 65.2 trillion yen. Okay, the vertical range. Okay, the vertical range between these two lines means that the revenue is inefficient. Tax revenue is inefficient. Okay? No, insufficient. the vertical range between these two lines means that tax revenue is insufficient. Okay. And the difference is a budget deficit. The budget deficit, yes, yeah, which is covered by issuing government bonds. Okay. Total expenditure minus tax revenue equals deficit, budget deficit, and deficit is covered by bond issuance, i.e. borrowing. Okay. For example, in 2022, the difference between 107.6 and 65.2 or 42.4. Okay, the difference is 42.4. Okay, just a moment. 42.4 trillion yen. Is the shortfall in tax revenue, while the amount of government bond issuance is this one, 36.9 trillion yen. Okay, 36.9 trillion yen is the amount of government bond issuance. In reality, these two figures do not exactly match. Okay, don't exactly match because there is about 5 trillion yen in non-tax revenue. But basically, that distance, okay, this distance between the two lines represents the amount of government bond issuance. Okay. Okay. There are several types of government bonds, but the two main types are construction bond and a special deficit financing bond. The use of the funds raised by construction bonds is limited to investment purposes. Special deficit financing bonds are not limited in use. They're not limited in use and can be used to finance current expenses. Okay. And we'll discuss the difference between these two bonds in another study session together. Okay. The blue portion, okay, the blue portion of the bar indicates the amount of construction bonds. Okay, construction bonds issued. And the pink portion indicates that of special deficit financing bonds. Okay. The expenditure continues to increase. The jump in spending in 2020 and 2021 is attributed to COVID-19. And if this is considered an exceptional matter, okay, if this is considered an exceptional matter, there is a stable trend. Okay? There is a stable trend in spending growth. On the other hand, such an increasing trend doesn't exist for the tax revenue. Until about 1919, the growth of tax revenue was about the same pace as that of expenditure. So the two lines are roughly parallel. Okay? The distance between them is close. These two lines are close. This means that the budget deficit is small, and the amount of government bond issued is small. However, after this time, 1990, yeah, after this time, tax revenue stopped growing for about 20 years until around 2010. Yeah? These 20 years, tax revenue remained flat or even showed a downward trend. Okay? A little bit downward trend. The parallel relationship between the two lines was broken, and the gap between spending and tax revenue, okay, the gap widened in a crotch-splitting fashion. Okay. In other words, Japan's budget deficit and government debt issuance increased sharply during this period. Japan's public finances have deteriorated sharply in the 2 decades. Okay, in the 2 decades since 1990. And in the most recent decade, the trend of increasing tax revenue, okay, the trend of increasing tax revenue appears to have resumed again, okay, and parallel between the two lines has also been restored. Although it appears that the terrible fiscal situation has come to a halt, the distance between the two lines remains large, okay? Parallel, but the distance is large. In other words, huge budget deficit is being posted every year. The distance between the two lines must be brought closer together as it once was. This process is closely related to Japan's economic situation. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Japanese economy grew at an average rate of about 4 to 5%. From the late 1980s, through 1990, there was a major economic expansion, which crashed around 1991, plunging the Japanese economy into a severe recession. The economic growth rate fell sharply with the recession. But not only that, Japan's economic growth rate as a long-term trend also began to stagnate after that time. In fact, Japan's economic growth rate over the 30 years since the 1990s has averaged only about 1%. The growth rate is about 1%. If the economy doesn't grow, tax revenue will not grow. In addition, tax cuts were implemented as an economic stimulus measure, okay? Tax cut during the recession, which contributed to the stagnation of tax revenues. These are the reasons why the tax revenue has been stagnant. Okay? On the other hand, spending could not be controlled. And continue to grow. Well, one of the reasons for this is that the government used fiscal stimulus to cope with the economic downturn. Until 1990, the average amount of government bond issuance was within about 10 trillion yen. Okay? 10 trillion yen on average. But this amount rapidly increased in the 1990s, and the 30 trillion yen level has become the norm. Okay? In the worst years, it exceeded 50 trillion yen. We'll discuss the historic background of Japan's public finances and the Japanese economy in another study session together. Okay? The ratio of bond issuance to total general account expenditure is called the bond dependency ratio. Okay. Bond dependency ratio. Bond dependency ratio is obtained by dividing the amount of bond issuance by the amount of total expenditure. It's more plausible that the denominator should be the total revenue. Okay. The denominator should be total revenue since the ratio is a measure of bond proceeds as a percentage of total revenue. This is the ratio of bond revenue to total revenue. However, there is no problem in writing this. Writing it this way, because the amount of revenue and the amount of total expenditure are equal. Okay. The following chart, yes, shows the trend of the bond dependency ratio. Around 1990, the bond dependency ratio was less than 10%, but it has since risen sharply, okay, to more than 30%, and this has become the norm. Okay, let's now compare the Japan's budget deficit with that of other countries around the world. The next chart shows an international comparison of the general government fiscal balance as a percentage of GDP. Yeah. Okay. General government. General government is the sum of central government, local government, and social security funds. A concept often used in international comparisons. Fiscal deficit exists not only in national government, but also in local government. In addition, the total local government budget deficit is in Japan, the total local government budget deficit is not large, okay? Not large in Japan, and it's nearly balanced. But in some countries, local governments have large budget deficits. Therefore, when making international comparisons, it's better to compare not only national but also local government budget deficits as a whole. Okay. And it's better to compare deficits as a percentage of the size of the economy rather than in absolute terms. This is because even the same amount of budget deficit has different implications for countries with large economies and countries with small economies. Okay. Okay. The red line represents Japan. The horizontal axis represents years, and the vertical axis is the ratio to GDP. Although it varies from year to year, Japan's budget deficit as a percentage of GDP ranges from 3 to 9%. It's common for countries around the world to have large budget deficits during recessions, such as the Great Financial Crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. Germany, Canada, Italy, France have had better budget deficits than Japan in most years since 2006. Japan's budget deficit is not so good, but it's not that bad. Okay? Actually, the US budget deficit has been worse than Japan's in most years. Okay. Okay, let's move on to the topic of debt. That is outstanding government debt. As we have seen, the Japanese government's finance is in the red every year, and the amount of government bonds issued has been increasing cumulatively. Okay, the following chart shows accumulated government general bonds outstanding. The horizontal axis represents years, and the vertical axis represents the amount of that debt. The unit is trillion of yen. As of 2022, the Japanese government's outstanding bonds amounted to 1,026 trillion yen. Since Japan's nominal GDP is about 550 trillion yen, this means that the Japanese government has outstanding debt of about twice the size of the economy. Okay? Twice the size of the economy. About 10 years ago, it was about 600 trillion yen, which is around half of the current amount. And 20 years ago, it was about 300 trillion yen, which is about 1/3 of the current amount. 50 years ago, in 1970, the outstanding debt was only 3 trillion yen. It's clear that the Japanese government's outstanding debt is snowballing and at a tremendous pace. This pace needs to slow down. This pace needs to slow down. Otherwise, Japan will one day find itself in a situation where it cannot repay its debt. There are several types of government bonds other than general bonds. So, depending on how statistics are compiled, the total amount could be much larger. But we often consider general bonds as the debt of the Japanese government. Therefore, it's safe to understand that the total debt of the Japanese government is around 1,000 trillion yen, which is about twice the size of the economy. In addition, general bonds are basically the sum of construction bonds, and special deficit financing bonds. Okay, let's now compare Japan's outstanding debt to that of other countries around the world. This chart shows an international comparison of general government outstanding debt to GDP. The table below shows data for major advanced countries. In 2021, Japan's general government debt to GDP ratio is 256.9%. This is by far the largest ratio of any country. Okay. Looking at the trends since 2006, Japan's ratio Japan's ratio has always been larger than that of other countries. This is shown in the line graph on the upper right. Okay. It's clear that Japan's fiscal situation is particularly bad among the major advanced countries. Now let's compare the data for all countries in the world, including developing countries. The same data is compared for 187 countries and regions, and to our surprise, Japan is the bottom. Okay, Japan is the bottom of the list. Japan is in the bottom of the list. It's no exaggeration to say that Japan's fiscal situation is the worst in the world. Okay. Now let's get into the summary. Number 1. Japan's budget deficit has been growing rapidly since around 1990 and continues to run annual budget deficits of approximately 30 to 40 trillion yen. The bond dependency ratio is approximately 30% to 40%. Compared to major advanced countries since 2006, Japan's fiscal situation is relatively poor, but not exactly so. Okay, number 2. Japan's outstanding government debt is about 1,000 trillion yen, roughly twice the size of the economy. The outstanding debt has continued to grow at a rapid pace, keeping pace with the expansion of the budget deficit since around 1990. Comparing this to major advanced countries since 2006, Japan's fiscal situation is by far the worst. Compared to 187 countries and regions, Japan ranks at the bottom of the list. Okay. Well, that's about it for today. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining. We'll be holding another study session again, so make sure to come back. If you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified when we hold the next one. Let's have study sessions together. See you again. また会いましょう。さよなら。Smash the like.